In the face of general and regional elections, there has been a plethora of utterances intended to sway one's view and one's decision in relation to their consideration to casting their vote. Today, with me to discuss some of the issues very topical in Guyana today and within and among the body politic is Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, Anil Nandlal. Thank you, Attorney General, for granting me this opportunity to discuss these very important issues.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. It's always a pleasure.
Okay, of course, I'm your host, Michael Gordon. If I could ask you first, Attorney General, Mr. Nandlal, the a Partnership for National Unity and the Alliance for Change recently formed this coalition that many believe, many are optimistic, will, and in their words, bring about change in Guyana. Let's first, and I know subsequent to the formation of the coalition, you have made a number of utterances in relation to its legality. Could you explain a bit about the legality and your view in relation to what is constitutional and what isn't?
Thank you very much, Gordon. I am of the considered view that the Accord, Commingsburg Accord, as it is labeled, is inherently in conflict with and in violation of the Constitution of the country. Indeed, it puts the presidential candidate and the prime ministerial candidate in conflict with the Constitution and places them in a very invidious position vis-a-vis the provisions of the Constitution. The Constitution, for example, clearly delineate and defines what the powers of the president are and what the responsibilities of the president are. And in most instances, the Constitution resides those powers with exclusivity in the president and the president alone. And the Constitution obliges the president to discharge the responsibilities which the Constitution devolves upon the president. Indeed, it is a ground for the removal of a president if that president violates the Constitution itself. Against that constitutional tapestry, one must examine the terms of the agreement. The agreement essentially allows Mr. Granger to, as presidential candidate, and assuming that he is elected to office, allows him, according to the agreement, to unilaterally, without reference to the Constitution and without the requisite amendments being made, allows him apparently to reduce his powers and correspondingly to confer those powers on his prime ministerial candidate. The prime ministerial, the office of the prime minister is also one that the Constitution creates, and it is also one of the offices that the Constitution defines what the responsibilities are in relation to that office. And there is no document that is extraneous to the Constitution which can increase those powers, so that the president cannot, a president cannot unilaterally, irrespective of the wide ambit of powers that he enjoys, he simply cannot, outside of the constitutional framework, by virtue of some third document or second document, increase those powers, because you will be violating the Constitution. So that is why I am of the view that the entire document itself is grounded in violation of the Constitution.
You're saying, in other words, the Commonwealth Accord is a parallel to the Constitution?
But,
If
but I am not saying so. That is what the document professes to be.
okay,
The document professes to imbue these persons, assuming that they win the elections. This is what they have signed on to. And what is even more bizarre is the fact that every constitutional office holder, starting from the president, prime minister, and every minister of government, would be required and is required to take an oath to uphold that constitution. So immediately after that oath is taken, that office holder is then placed in a precarious conundrum. To which document will he, will he, to which document will he obey? Because the documents are conflicting. And if you do not obey the Constitution, which you have taken an oath to uphold, you are liable to be removed from any of the offices to which you would have been appointed. So the document itself has some deep philosophical and constitutional defects, and I don't know how they will reconcile them. Fortunately, I am of the view that they will not win the elections, and therefore we may not have to confront the difficulties that this situation present, except that to say that I believe that it is incumbent upon me to explain to the Guyanese populace the nature of this arrangement and to express my personal view that I believe that there is no bona fide and there is no intention whatsoever to uphold that arrangement should the unlikely eventuality of their winning occurs, because it simply cannot be given effect to. And I believe that it is a fraud on the population, it is a farce, and it is intended to deceive people in voting in a particular way. And I believe that I have a responsibility to make that public and to draw to the populace attention the deficiencies which afflict this political engagement or marriage, as some are describing it as.
uh, if I could speak a bit to the history of coalitions in the Caribbean, and if I could bring it a bit closer to home, the history of coalitions in Guyana, could you address that in the context of your optimism of in the eventuality of a coalition government being the next government of the Republic of Guyana? In that eventuality, could you speak a bit to the history of coalitions, especially in the Guyana context?
Thank you very much. You have a dominant partner in this coalition is the People's National Congress. The People's National Congress has a history, and in particular, they have addressed the question of coalition on a number of occasions. During the early 60s, Dr. Chedi Jagan, as leader of the PPP, made a number of attempts to build a national front government. He was in the government at the time, and on every occasion, Mr. Forbes Burnham, leader of the PNC, rejected it. In fact, his problems with the PPP arose because of his position of leader or nothing. And that type of philosophy has dominated the history of the PNC long after that position adopted by Forbes Burnham in the 50s and 60s. They eventually entered into a coalition agreement in 1964, not with the PPP, but with the UF. And expectedly, having regard to the philosophy that informs the leader at the time, and I have no doubt the entire hierarchical structure of the executive of the PNC, that coalition did not last. The coalition was with the United Force, and every member, except a few, in that coalition were kicked out by Forbes Burnham, who made a public statement saying that the PNC will never enter into a coalition again. Then in the 70s, again, the PPP tried to have a coalition with the PNC, and repeatedly it was rejected. In 1980, in the 80s, again, the PPP tried, and it was rejected. When you juxtapose that against how they behave in government when they enjoyed governmental power, then it reinforces my argument that they do not embrace coalition politics. Why do I say so? You looked at elections which we had while they were in government, and other than 1992, every single one of those elections were rigged. Every single one of them. And I don't think that we should even begin to dispute that. That those are facts. Every one of them were rigged. The army was used as an instrument at that time in that process which rigged the elections, and Mr. David Granger was in the hierarchical leadership of the army at the time. So any attempt to distance him from the role that the army played would be less than honest. Then you look at, so you had them perpetuating themselves in power by rigged elections. And then you look at their approach to political opponents, and you see that they employ violence, intimidation, and sometimes use lethal force to confront opposition elements. We have a commission of inquiry ongoing into the death of Walter Rodney, and the evidence that is unfolding before the nation emanating from that commission is quite frightening, because one of the terms of reference of that commission is to inquire into the atmosphere, political atmosphere, at the time when Dr. Rodney was killed. And that is why so many people are coming to outline what the political climate in the country was at the time. You had two persons, two young men at 64 Village on the Quarantine Coast in 1973 who were gunned down by the army simply because they requested that their ballots be counted at the place of poll. You had the issue of press freedom. You had one, you didn't have a television station, you had one newspaper in the country, absolutely controlled by the government. The Mirror newspaper was denied newsprint to publish newspapers. Journalists were on a repeated basis harassed and beaten, imprisoned. You had Father Dark, a photographer with the Catholic Standard, who was murdered in broad daylight on Brick Dam. And Moses Nagamutu knows this very well. He was in the journalistic fraternity at the time. So that is why he's now saying that we must not be enslaved by our past, because he doesn't want us to revisit these matters. He knows fully well. Then, in addition to that, you had the manner in which they rigged. They did not rig ordinarily. They rigged in such a massive way that they controlled the entire parliament. So they rigged in such a way that they gave themselves a 2/3 majority. So they control the parliament. So they control the executive by unlawful method, and then that rigging extended to the control of the parliament. And then you come to the judiciary, the third arm of government. We had in 1970 appeals to the Privy Council, an external court in England to which people could have appealed if they were dissatisfied with a decision of the court system in Guyana. Burnham, using the argument that we must relinquish ourselves from all vestiges of colonialism, abolished appeals to that court. In fact, abolished that court from the legal system of the country, thereby creating a structure that presumably he can control. Now, if you wish to examine whether he has controlled it, just take into account the fact that during the years that they promulgated the issue of party paramountcy, because they said that the party, the PNC party, was paramount to the state, and every state agency in the country was subject and subservient to the party. That is the philosophy of party paramountcy. To demonstrate that, they took the party flag, the PNC flag, and they flew it over the Guyana Court of Appeal, over and above the national flag, signaling to the nation and signaling to the world that the judiciary is subject to and subservient to, and obviously manipulable by the People's National Congress. So every center of power in the country was dominated by the PNC. Now, against that background, do you think that these are people who are interested in coalition politics? I don't want to stop there. I want to deal with them in opposition as well.
I'm going to give you an opportunity to deal with the PNC in opposition. Against that background, you speak against that background. However, there is a reality against the backdrop where you find many young people, especially on social media, particularly expressly stating that they are disinterested about that era in Guyana's history. They appear to, those young people who have voiced their views,
All right.
they appear to be interested in what obtains today.
Okay, let me deal with what obtains today. So let us fast forward to 1992 now. In 1992, we managed, after a long 28 years of struggle, to bring free and fair elections to the country. It was the first time that we got organizations like the Carter Center and the international observer groups to come here and observe those elections. Those elections were certified to be free and fair. Mr. Desmond Hoyt eventually accepted the results of those elections, but not the many, many executives of his party. And as a result, there was mayhem in the streets of our country. Violence, buildings were burnt, innocent people were beaten. Then, fast forward to 97 elections. We are very current now. I'm coming till up to 2001 just now. Then you have the 97 elections. Again, those elections were observed by foreign observers of high caliber, international stature, and they were certified to be free and fair. And again, the results were not accepted. And you had chaos, mayhem, beatings, violence, arson on private people's property and property belonging to the state. Innocent people were beaten. As a result, the government, the PPP civic administration, was forced to give up 2 years of government. Because remember, we entered into the Harmanston Accord, going to another elections, 2001. Those elections again were observed to be free and fair, were certified by international observer groups to be free and fair. When the results were disclosed, violence again. Violence extending all the way on the East Coast. People's buildings were burnt, innocent people were beaten. That is the record. Now look at the record of the PNC in their own congresses. Let us don't go back very far. In 2014, they had a congress. This is their own congress. They had a congress in 2014 August, and Mr. Granger contested for the leadership. Mr. Greenidge also contested for the leadership. After those elections, Mr. Carl Greenidge lost. Mr. Carl Greenidge, along with Mr. Aubrey Norton, Mr. Sharma Solomon, Miss Vanessa Kissoon, and dozens of participants at that Congress went on national television and said to the world that those elections were rigged. This is not me saying so. And this is not 20 years ago. This is only last year. They said to the world that those elections were rigged, that persons were disenfranchised, that the lists were padded, that people who were registered to vote were disenfranchised. And when they sought to raise their voice in protest against what they perceived to be wrongdoings, there were shootings at Congress Place. So I say all of that to give you a litany of the antecedents of the party that claims to embrace coalition politics. Let me deal with the parliament, for example, because as of 2011, they control the parliament. Let us look at their behavior in the parliament that they exercised control over for the first time since 1992. The first business of any parliament is to elect a speaker and a deputy speaker. Since 1992, we won a majority in the parliament until 2011. Every single time we ensured that, of course, we took the speaker position because we control the parliament, and we ensured that the opposition was given the position of deputy speaker. One would have expected that that precedent would have been followed, that at a minimum we would have been allowed to keep the position of deputy speaker. What happened? They grabbed the speaker position as well as the deputy speaker. In so doing, Mr. Ramjatan attempted to get the opposition to accept Mr. Moses Nagamutu as the speaker. And you can recall what Mr. Granger said. Mr. Granger rejected Mr. Moses Nagamutu as speaker on the ground that he doesn't trust him. Now, what has changed about Moses Nagamutu for Mr. Granger to trust him 2 years hence? Look at what they did to Clement Rohi. And let me show you the authoritarianism about which I speak. Remember, they came up with this bizarre theory that Rohi gave instructions for police to shoot protesters at Linden. As a result, we held an international inquiry. Of course, the inquiry embarrassed them and exonerated Rohi rather than implicate Rohi. And that by itself is something that we should discuss at some point in time. But notwithstanding the fact that the Commission of Inquiry exonerated Rohi, they made a decision to gag Rohi from speaking. Recall during the height of the dictatorship, Chedi Jagan was also banned from speaking in the parliament. 30 years hence, a little power given to them in the parliament, and Rohi was banned. At that time, Chedi Jagan was the general secretary of the People's Progressive Party and leader of the opposition. Fast forward 30 years hence, Clement Rohi at the time was the general secretary of the People's Progressive Party and the Minister of Home Affairs. So this was not an ordinary member of parliament that they were gagging. This is the Minister of Home Affairs and the General Secretary of the governing party. We went to court and I got a court order to say that their gagging of Rohi was unconstitutional. They never obeyed that court order. The Speaker himself of the National Assembly ruled that their gagging of Rohi was unconstitutional. Yet they did not allow Rohi to speak, even up to when Parliament went into recess prior to the prorogation and then its eventual dissolution. Rohi was prevented from presenting any bills in the National Assembly. I say all of that to say, if they are prepared with a little power to use it to gag a powerful office holder and personage in the form of Clement Rohi, what do you think they will do to the ordinary people of this country if they get governmental power? And those are the reasons why I say that their record, their philosophy, their antecedents, their history do not suggest that they would embrace democratic concepts and they would embrace any form of coalition.
It would be remiss of me if I concluded, and time is against us, if I concluded this interview without discussing with you a very topical issue in the Guyanese society today. And this is the murder of political activist Courtney Cromie-Wing. Your ministry has been the center of protests, first by Cromie-Wing, the late Courtney Cromie-Wing, and now those who sympathize with the family of the Cromie-Wings. Would you care to react to this?
Well, first of all, let me say that I wish to express my deepest condolences to the parents, the children, and the relatives of Mr. Cromie-Wing. And let me condemn in the strongest possible terms. His death and the manner in which he met his death. What I don't understand is why my ministry was or is being used as a forum to protest. Um, the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Ministry of Legal Affairs, and the Attorney General Chambers, we do not hold any responsibility whatsoever for the investigation of crime and criminal conduct. That is the function of the Commissioner of Police. What I do know, however, is that by coming and protesting in front of that ministry, those who choose that method are exposing myself and my family and the staff of that ministry to danger, because there are extreme elements out there that can do wild things, and to somehow connect my ministry to to unfortunate that unfortunate and tragic death is quite unfortunate, and I hope that reason will prevail and they will not expose the staff of that ministry unnecessarily to harm.
Mr. Crummy Wing would have protested your ministry. Have you at any time, or are you aware that efforts would have been made to engage Mr. Crummy Wing, perhaps on the gist of his protest? Or do you think they were
I
purely
saw
politically?
Mr. Cromwing was there for I don't know how long, but more than a month. Not once did I ever engage him. Not once did I ever interfere with his right to protest. Not once did I attempt to stop him from protesting. I have never exchanged a single word with the gentleman. I went into the ministry and left the ministry, and he was always there. And fortunately, while he was there, he appeared, it was safe. Um, I have no idea what happened thereafter. And he left that precincts of the ministry nearly 2 months ago. I am shocked, like everyone else, by his demise.
As we edge closer to nomination day, if not necessarily the Attorney General, Anil Nandlal, were to say to the electorate, uh, what ought to sway your decision, or what should be your considerations to casting your vote, the theme of this interview, what would Anil Nandlal say?
I would say that this is a straight race between the PNC and the PPP. I will disregard the name change and the label of a coalition. As I said, my own view is that it is a facade, it is a charade, it is not rooted in reality, it is not rooted in the Constitution, it is not rooted in pragmatism. So it is a clear race between the PNC and the PPP. You have the PNC, you had the PNC in government, and therefore you have a track record of 28 years to judge them by. And you have the PPP in government, and you have a track record of 28, 22 years to judge us by. And it's as simple as that. I cannot understand how the rational mind will have any difficulty in making a decision between these two parties. You had economic stagnation, you had bankruptcy of the economy, you had a national debt that was uncontrollable, you had banning of basic food items, you have a taking away of democracy from the country, you have the privation of freedom and civil liberties in the country. So, and as a result, you had mass migration. Then fast forward to 22 years in government and just look around at the progress. Look at the housing schemes. Look at how well our children are doing at the CXC exams. Look at how the fact that we are growing as a country in a very adverse political environment at a rate of 4.5% per annum over the last 9 consecutive years, the highest growth rate in the Caribbean. You look at the fact that we are able to raise salaries for our public servants and social benefits for our pensioners annually and increasing them annually. Look at the fact that we have been able to move interest rate at the bank from 38% as it was in 1992 to 4.5% for a low-income loan. And I can go on to give you a litany of comparative data that will make the job of or to make the choice of who to vote for so pellucid and so clear that it boggles the rational mind why the voter should be confused.
Minister of Legal Affairs, Attorney General Alan Landlal, thanks for discussing these very important issues with me, and I thank you for joining us. I'm, of course, Michael Gordon.